This is the Editor's Half Hour. Step into the life of an editor for 30 minutes as we discuss the craft of editing, industry trends, and editorial resources. Your host is co-founder and CEO of Peak Publishing Inc., Nadia Jaja Pupa. She is experienced in all facets of the publishing industry, from editing to design, and works with corporate clients and self-published authors. Nadia and her guests are about to share powerful insights and stories on what it takes to be an editor. And this is your host, Nadia Jaja Pupa.
Welcome, listeners, to the Editor's Half Hour. This is the season finale of season 2 of the podcast, and it's so exciting. And we are ending this year with a bang. Trust me, you're going to love this episode. We are talking about comic book editing, comic book proofreading, and everything about what it takes to deal with comic books. And I have the wonderful guest today, Madeleine Vasaly. She is the author of The Proofreader's Guide to Comic Book Style. So this is huge. This is a big deal for all proofreaders out there who are dealing with comic books. It's huge for curious minds, people who are interested in comic books and what goes into it. So we are going to try our best to cover as much material as we can because Madeleine's book is so much fun. So welcome, Madeleine. I am so happy to have you. I can't thank you enough. I know you're so busy because you just recently launched the book. So you're doing a lot right now. So I appreciate you taking the time today. So welcome, and please introduce yourself and share with the listeners what you're doing. Obviously, you've published a book, other things that you edit as well, because it's not just comic books.
Thanks so much for having me. So I am an editor and proofreader and style guide developer for comics, books, online news, and really anything else that deals with words. So I wrote The Proofreader's Guide to Comic Book Style because when I started out in comics, I discovered that there wasn't a resource like that. There are some wonderful books about bigger picture editing, about lettering, about writing, but there wasn't really a reference that I could go to that talked about the style conventions. And as a proofreader, that's obviously something that I was really focused on. And so after working with comics for a while, and after some encouragement by very well-meaning editor friends, I decided to write that book myself. I have worked on a variety of comics for a variety of ages, lengths, genres, and when I'm not doing comics, I specialize in trade nonfiction in books, although I do fiction as well, and I've worked for a number of online news outlets as well.
Oh, that's so much fun. This is just so cool. And it is so exciting to me. When I first saw that you were doing this, I think before you officially published the book, I was thrilled because I have been a comic book fan since I was a kid. I grew up reading Archie comics. That was my go-to. I wasn't into the Marvel. I mean, we had a few Marvel comics, but they weren't as exciting to me as the Archie comics and Sabrina, the Teenage Witch. I'm trying to think of some other ones, but I've always had comics have always had a special place in my heart. So it goes way back, but I want to hear about you. What is your origin story on comic books? Were you also reading them a lot when you were young, or did you get into them later in your life?
I really wasn't a comics reader as a kid. I definitely read the newspaper strips growing up. Like every morning I would read them with breakfast, but I don't think I read my first comic book until I was in college, and I really wasn't a super heavy reader at the time that I started working in comics. So working in comics was actually a gateway for me to read more, and that's part of the reason that I wanted to write the book is editors who are maybe interested in this type of work but are not super heavy comic readers might not be aware of some of the conventions that to a regular reader would be just assumed. And I wanted to have that be accessible both to people who maybe have been readers but don't know about all of the nitty gritty style and lettering stuff that goes on behind the scenes, but also to people who are really experienced copy editors or proofreaders in other media and are interested in comics, but this is a whole new world for them. And obviously, in any genre,
Mhm.
the more widely you read, the better an editor and the better a proofreader you're going to be. So it's certainly not a replacement
Right.
for reading and being familiar with what's out there. But
Right.
my goal was basically to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit on some of that.
Yes, and you did. And you did it fabulously. And what she means by that, and I guess I should say what I mean by that, is the diagrams of the workflow. You listeners, just trust me. You got to get this book. The workflow is fantastic. She breaks it down into the steps. And I think we could just dive right in because you outline all of those roles. There's inking, lettering, coloring. These are new to me. And so I just fair warning that I may confuse these roles because these are still relatively new to me, completely outside of the comic book industry. Other than just being a reader, there are so many things when I'm going through your book that I take for granted. And we're going to get into this too about balloons or bubbles and all the different types. As a reader, those have personalities. They take on their own personality, and it's so cool. But let's before we get into balloons and lettering, let's talk about the actual roles of the creative roles and how that is important for the proofreader, the copy editor, and the editor. And then the other thing too, before we even get into the creative side, let's talk about editing. This is the editor's half hour after all. The editor, the role of the editor, explain to us how that's different from an editor who's handling prose.
Absolutely. So in prose, editor tends to be sort of a broad umbrella term. You could be talking about an acquiring editor, a developmental editor, a copy editor, a line editor. In comics, editor is a very specific role. And when you're talking about an in house editor, that's generally someone who is acquiring or commissioning work, someone who's working with the writer to do developmental work. They are working directly with the penciler, the inker, the letterer, the colorist, some of whom may be the same person, to do general art direction and feedback and sort of a bit of project management to keep all of those pieces moving properly. They're communicating with the in-house design or production team. They're really doing a lot of things. But when you see a reference to a comic book editor in the wild, that is referring to a specific role. So a copy editor, to the extent that that exists in comics, which we can talk about,
Yeah.
that a copy editor is not going to be referred to as an editor in comics. So that's a really crucial distinction between prose and comics, and something that I think a lot of people who are new to the medium can get a little confused by.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's good to clarify that too, because that editor is, like you said, similar to a project manager. They're handling that conversation with the creative team. And that creative team consists of a letterer, like you said, a penciler, inker. What else am I missing?
Yeah,
Let's talk about
yeah, I
these.
would say
Let's
the editor in comics has a lot in common with like an acquisitions editor in prose. And that's sort of
Oh,
the
okay.
closest analog, especially
Okay.
an acquisitions editor in something like a children's illustrated book where you're dealing with artists
Hmm.
and writers. That's sort of the closest analog, but obviously the publishing process is just a little bit different. Um, and it can vary depending on whether you're talking about a dedicated comics publisher versus a comics imprint at a book publisher. But there are still always going to be some
Okay.
distinctions.
Okay. Very cool. So, what is a letterer? What do they do? Do they just actually handwrite the letters like that? That in my head, and it's so funny because before I even read your book, in my head, I'm like, oh, there's the writer who's writing the story. Then there's the illustrator, and that's it, right? And then I open up your book and I'm like, oh my God, what is a letterer? What is a penciler? I obviously that's kind of given, what a penciler does, but I didn't know that there was a distinction between inking and coloring, and that I guess I just assumed that one person did it all, and that's not the case, and that's so cool to know.
So sometimes the same person does do all of those things, especially for self-published comics. The same person may write, pencil, ink, color, letter, everything. At a traditional publisher, whether comics or a comics imprint at a prose publisher, they're generally going to be divvied up at least somewhat. So just to kind of go over the roles really generally, the writer, of course, writes, although that can sometimes be divided into the person who sort of comes up with the concept and the world building versus the person who actually writes the specific script. But very often those are the same person. You have on the art side, the penciler is generally the first person who interprets the writer's script into artwork. The inker builds on the penciler's work to create the final black and white artwork. And the colorist, if the comic is in color, applies colors to the inker's work. So the work of each person builds on the
Okay.
previous one. And again, two or all three of those could be the same person. It really just depends on the comic, the creators, the publisher. Just as in anything, it can vary individually. The letterer shares a lot in common with a typesetter in prose, but they're in other ways very different animals. So the letterer is responsible for not only the literal letters on the page, all of the words, but also the shapes that those letters go into. So the text balloons, the caption boxes, and in many cases, they're also responsible for sound effects. Sound effects may be an artist responsibility, may be a letterer responsibility, or could be shared. But very often the letterer is creating sound effects. So it's very much not just dealing with text, although that is obviously an extremely important element in any type of publishing. But it's very much a creative role, and the letterer is part of the creative team. The comic industry awards have best lettering awards for a reason. It is often a very underrated part of comics, and the skill and the style of the lettering can really have a huge impact on your experience of a story. And as a copy editor or proofreader, that's generally the person that you're, aside from the writer, who your work is going to impact the most, because you are, reviewing how the lettering is arranged on the page, and also the letterer is probably going to be the one going in and applying your proofreading corrections, unless an in-house production artist is doing it instead.
And so the letterer is so different from a typesetter, which we can talk about later. And sometimes that can get confusing when you hear those two terms. You might use them interchangeably, but they're completely different things. And so we can get into that when we talk about balloons. But the letter specifically, when I saw you had a whole section devoted to the crossbar I was like, what the hell is that? I was like, what is that? Like, I saw the heading. I'm like, what crossbar I? And then I was like, oh, when I saw it, I was like, that is so interesting that the actual letter I with the crossbars, the capital letter I, if the dialogue, if it starts the sentence, that would be used. In some cases, it is or it's not, or is it common that that's what's used? But then inside of a sentence, if the word I is mentioned, it's not with the crossbars. Is that right? Do I have that right?
So
or my understanding of it?
The key function of the crossbar I is for the personal pronoun. So anytime you have I've, that's going to have the crossbars. Some publishers will also use the crossbar I for some limited other applications. Like you mentioned, they might use it for the first word in a sentence, or a proper noun, for Roman numerals, that sort of thing. And then the rest of the time, the /I is just a plain line.
Yeah.
And occasionally, a letterer will just use /I's for the entire comic as a creative choice. But on the other hand, you're not going to see, at least among professional editors, you won't, or professional letterers, you won't see the crossbar I used, in the middle of a word. It's just one of those. There are
Right.
very few absolute rules, either in comics or any other type of publishing, but that's about as close to an absolute rule as you can get. A crossbar I in the
Right.
middle of a word is usually seen as the hallmark of an inexperienced letterer, or sometimes an inexperienced proofreader. So that's one of those little details that you have to watch for. I tend to compare it to the end dash in prose publishing. End dashes are sometimes used in comics, but very often not. But the crossbar I, to me, occupies kind of a similar space because it's this little nicety that the proofreader is going to notice, the other professionals who are working on the book are going to notice, but most readers are at least not consciously going to notice it or care. But I think even more than the end dash, the crossbar I, even if the reader doesn't notice it consciously, if it's used wrong, I think there's sort of a subconscious thing where something just doesn't feel quite right or quite polished about this comic, and they
Yes.
can't put their finger on why.
Yes, yes, and that's what that's what it was like that. It exploded my brain. I was like, "Oh, what?" And as I'm reading, I'm like, "Yes, I would." You wouldn't be able to quite put your finger on it if you saw the crossbar I used in the word like give or something, and you'd be like, something looks whatever," and you might just continue reading and not quite realize how much it affects the flow of reading the comics. The whole experience is off a little bit. And so yeah, then I of course as soon as I read that part of the book, I'm opening up the comic books that I'm reading to my kids. And I'm like, "Oh my god, it's so true." And so I love that you singled that out in the book and how eye-opening it was for me to read that. And I thought, "Wow." So that crossbar I has a whole um it has guidelines, it has rules, it's part of the style, and that's so great, and it's so important for the proofreading process. So yeah, I'm looking at comic books with a whole different lens now after reading your book. It really is pulling back that curtain a little bit. And so these letters go into something called a you can finish my sentence.
A balloon or a bubble, depending on who you talk to, people will have very strong opinions.
Right.
In the US, balloon is generally the standard term, and some people get very up in arms about that. A lot of readers, especially readers who maybe are new to comics,
Hmm.
bubble is um, I find really common just among lay readers.
Yeah.
And so I say
Yeah.
balloon, but
Oh,
it's
you
not that
do?
deep. It's
Are
fine.
you team are you team balloon or team bubble? I mean, it's just funny because I'm making this up, but you know, by calling it teams, like it's so divided. I don't know if it's that divided, but last night, I was talking to my kids and my husband, like, so tomorrow I'm talking to an editor, I'm telling them about my podcast, and my kids are young. I wouldn't talk to them like that if they were older, but I'm like, oh, so tomorrow I'm talking to an editor who specializes in comic books. And um, I said, so what do you call that thing when you see the words? I didn't want to sway them one way or another, but they both my kids say bubble, and my husband as well, and same for me. So I naturally would just call it a word bubble, but it's interesting that in the U.S. it's typically called a balloon. And so what would happen in your experience in like in the work, like in I guess in an office environment that specializes in comic books, if it's a publishing company or whatever, would they get annoyed if you were calling it a bubble and no, it's a balloon? Like what was the general vibe surrounding the two terms?
I mean, I think it really depends on the individual person. There are certain
Okay.
people and certain companies that are always going to be a little gatekeepy. Um,
Yeah.
it's really not that serious. If you are new to comics work, I would recommend using Balloon with creators and
Okay.
publishers in the US, just because it it will reduce friction. Some people really care passionately. I don't see why you should,
Yeah.
but it's
Okay.
it's undeniable that Balloon among professional creators in the US is the dominant
Okay.
word.
In the US. just knowing this is cool. You know what I'm saying? Like, I would never know this information had I not read your book and thought, oh, I guess it's a balloon. Oh, wait, it's a bubble. No, wait. And then I'm reading it. I'm like, oh, this is so interesting. But I have a whole list. And as I looked at it, I'm saying I have a list that I extracted from the book. And as I was looking at the list that Madeline created, it was mind blowing because as a reader, you don't realize how much personality that these balloons take on. And I'll go through them quickly because I know we've only got a half hour. This could be like a 3-hour conversation. You know that. But that's why I want to encourage listeners to buy this book because it's so much fun. Um, Anyway, so the first on the list is electric. So there's a shape of a balloon that has like kind of spiky edges, and that is more of like radio, right, Madeline? Would you
Really
say?
anything that's sort of electronic communication. So if you've got speech that's coming through radio or a TV or a walkie-talkie, anything like that, it has a million different other names too. You might see comms balloon or radio balloon.
Okay. I love it. And I'll go through the rest of them quickly. So if somebody's cold and it's like the words are like brr, you'll see like the ice, like icicles in the balloon. Again, these are things you don't really notice until you're reading it, or when you're reading it, you might glaze over, but it's that added level of kind of that professionalism too of adding to the vibe and the experience. There's the inverted tail if there's off-panel speech, somebody maybe not just in the panel, but outside of it. There's the outline to maybe create emphasis, and you can jump in at any time and cut me off if I'm saying anything incorrectly. But the rough, jagged edge for distorted speech, maybe to portray weakness with wavy lines is another one. Now, here's one that I was like, what? There's a name for this? A squink? Is that right?
Yep.
Tell us what a squink is. This is so cool to me.
So if you have speech in a comic that is coming from the other side of some sort of barrier, so if someone is speaking, say, from the other side of a door, like the door is in between the speaker and the reader, or maybe someone is inside a car or speaking through a window, the speech balloon tail will generally end with a squink, which is this little burst. And not every comic will necessarily use it for that, but it just indicates that there's that barrier there, and it's just one of those little style traditions, and a word that you would have no reason to know if you don't work in comics.
I know, and I love that I know that now. And I think that's what's so cool about your book is when I saw that, I was like, oh my God, yeah, a squink is what it's called. And I've seen it used behind a door if like a parent or somebody, a character is behind the door talking to the kid in the bedroom. It's like a thing that it's just so funny that it's has its own name. Then there's like that telepathic, if there's telepathic conversations happening between characters. What does that telepathic look like? Does it have like dashed lines or no? That's something else.
And honestly, I've seen infinite varieties of telepathic balloons. And that's one of the
Okay.
great things is that, there are some common conventions for how these balloons tend to look, just because that's what readers are used to and what they expect. But, letterers are wonderfully infinitely creative, and you can see all kinds of different styles. So for telepathy, for example, you might see a little wavy tailless balloon, or you might see radiating lines coming out
Okay.
from it, or you might just see special colors. I really
Oh,
love what you mentioned,
yeah.
how you might not consciously notice the balloon styles, but they contribute to the overall vibe. And I definitely agree. That's one of the great things about lettering is when it's done really well, it's not necessarily jumping out at you off the page, although sometimes it is and it can be delightful. But so often it's really just seamlessly contributing to the mood, the feel, and you don't even necessarily notice that a special style is being used for a specific type of speech. But because it embodies the vibe of that speech so well, you immediately understand how that person is speaking. And I always love seeing creative ideas in lettering.
Yes. Yes. I love it so much. And didn't even talk about whispering and thoughts, internal thoughts, which is that more of that cloud like balloon. And the whispering is more like the faded lines or maybe like the dash, like little dash lines or something like whispering to one another. There's also like the crosstalk or dialogue in between characters with the connected balloons. And so why these are so important for proofreaders is because the placement of the balloon, the white space within the balloon, placement meaning if it's kind of going off the panel a little bit, if it's within the panel, there's different terms that you outline and you show in this book. Just gosh, I just love this book. I really, really enjoyed this. I really, and I know I'm like fangirling, but I'm telling you, when I was looking at this book, I thought, oh my God, never once. And even as an editor, when you're reading, I'm a reader and that's it. I turn it off. Sometimes it's hard if I'm reading fiction and something outside, but comic books are so different. You're absorbing and enjoying not only a story, but it's a visual story. And we're talking comic books. This is similar to graphic novels. I mean, graphic novels, it's very similar to, the nuances behind just a typical comic book. But these are all like part of that proofreading process. So let's talk about the proofreading process. I have so many questions for you about building a style sheet. I want to know, like, because even writing this book is technically like a glorified style sheet. It's a style guide. The whole process, you must have had so much fun doing this. I'm just assuming here, but tell me a little bit about that whole experience of writing this book.
It's been a wild process because it started off as a very small project. I was just originally going to create a short PDF booklet, make it available through my website in some form, and then it just sort of kept growing. And uh, I ended up covering much more ground than I originally planned to. I added a whole chapter on script that I wasn't originally planning on going into, and then I got some feedback from the wonderful Tanya Gold, who was one of my content reviewers, and
Great.
they made some good points and convinced me to specifically address scripts from the copy editor's viewpoint. So it really
I love
just
it.
kept growing and morphing until I finally decided, well, I guess this is going to be an actual whole full length book. There's going to be an ebook format. There's going to be a print format. And yeah, it just sort of got away from me.
I love that. I love that. I think that that's so amazing to me that you had intended on creating a resource. Just put it online, but then it, like you said, it grew and grew and grew because you realize that these nuances, they carry a lot of weight. And these balloons that we talked about, we can keep going, right? We can keep going about the padding, the placement, because those things are collectively so important for the proofreader. They're so important for the final product. And I do need to address the fact that you address different audiences for the book. You're talking to a writer, you can address the publisher, the main editor, copy editor, and proofreader. And you really, I mean, you don't break it down that into that, specific detail, but enough where you do have these sidebars scattered throughout the book for the publisher. You put emphasis on the importance of that style guide or in-house style guide or style sheet, uh, which is so great. And you even have a sidebar making reference to accessibility, which I thought was so cool. So share a little bit about that. You have some references to some books that you mentioned. Accessibility is so important for comic books. And personally, I have a personal prediction, and maybe you can agree that I do think that that is going to be heavier in the future, that a time and attention on accessibility. I hope. Maybe it's more of a hope. I hope that accessibility is part of that conversation in the publishing company's perspective. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about accessibility.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I really hope that we see more and more accessibility for comics going forward. It's obviously a more complex process than making a text-only book accessible, but there are ways to do it, and publishers really just need to consider the investment in expanding their readership. Comics are inherently a visual medium, but there are a number of really interesting ways that creators have found or proposed for making comics accessible, from audio narration to really interesting, like physical tactile solutions. And I have not had the privilege of working on any of those myself, but I am always so delighted to see more ideas for that out in the world. And I really hope that more creators and publishers take that to heart, and incorporate that into their workflow. Just like with a print book, the earlier in the process you can bring that in, the easier it is to kind of integrate that into the workflow.
I love it. I love that you're so mindful about that and including it. Very astute of you, I have to say. So I do love this, and I love the sidebars. I love that there's something for everyone. Like I said, the writer, publisher, there's something to gain from this book, and it's just so fun. And again, there's really nothing else out there like it. And I'm so glad you filled that gap that you knew you identified was missing. And you're like, I'm going to write this thing. And I'm so glad you did. So where can we find you? Where there's maybe conferences coming up. Where are you going to be next year? Can I get a copy signed? Can I buy a physical copy? Tell us where the book is, where we can go. And of course, I'll put links in the show notes. But where can the listeners find you?
So for now, the book is available through comicbookstyle.com, and it will be available in at least one or two brick and mortar stores in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. So watch for information on that. I will be attending the ACES conference in spring 2025. So I will try to bring some copies along there.
Yes, do it.
And I have not finalized sort of my plans for wider distribution. I will eventually be bringing sales to channels outside my own website, but for now it's just going to be through there. I have the paperback and the PDF ebook for now. The EPUB is still in progress because, speaking of accessibility, accessibility is my first and foremost priority with the EPUB format, and I really wanted to take the time to make sure that it's as optimized and accessible and readable for as many readers as possible. So that one will be following separately. The PDF edition of the ebook, I am doing everything I can within sort of the confines of both the file format and the sort of fixed layout style of that book. But really the accessibility optimized version is going to be that EPUB, which I'm excited to get finished.
So cool. So cool. Well, I hope I can get a physical copy and have you sign it. I'm planning on being at ACES in the spring, so I will be looking for you, and so will your several adoring fans. Whoever attends ACES, look for Madeleine. I'm so excited. Well, I hate that we have to end our conversation because we could have talked a little bit about some other things, but I again can't thank you enough, Madeleine, for spending the time today to share information about this groundbreaking book, in my opinion. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Hey listeners, don't go away just yet. We have a really quick announcement to make. I have Katira here. We have partnered on a really exciting thing, which is the 2025 Editor's Calendar. I'd like to hand it over to Katira to share some information about why we're doing this and the exciting news.
Yes, thank you so much, Nadia. And yes, I had this idea a few years ago, actually, and just never acted on it, but I wanted to create a calendar to bring editors to the forefront. We all know we do lots of work behind the scenes that sometimes goes unrecognized. So I wanted to create opportunity for people to see the people behind the book magic that is out there. So I'm super excited to collaborate with Nadia, and Nadia, of course, has created the editing affirmation cards, and I saw the graphic design on those and decided I wanted her to help me with my calendar. So that is why I specifically tapped Nadia, and I'm excited that all of our spots are full for the calendar already. And excited to see so many powerful and prominent and successful and also down-to-earth editors who have signed up to join the calendar. So thank you, Nadia, for your support and collaborating with me. If you're interested in purchasing the 2025 Editor's Calendar, feel free to email me at Poland, that's Polland, at love4words.com, and I'll be happy to get you signed up to get your copy. And thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Editor's Half Hour. This podcast is your go-to resource for editorial trends, opening the discussion for new ideas through the real-life stories of editors. For more information about Nadia Jaja Pupa and her business, visit peakpublishing.com. That's PIQUE publishing.com. And remember to subscribe and follow the Editor's Half Hour wherever you get your podcasts.